They were ghosts marching into a furnace. 10,000 souls haunted by starvation, surrounded by the finest army in the Muslim world. For them, death was not a threat, it was a certainty. But for their leader, a 68-year-old emperor known as the Redbeard, this was not an end. It was a trap, and the entire Seljuk Empire was about to walk into it. This is the true story of the Battle of Iconium, a day of blood and genius that history almost forgot. The Anatolian sun in May of 1190 was a merciless brass hammer, beating down on a landscape of dust and despair. It baked the armor of the last 15,000 men of Frederick Barbarossa's once glorious crusading army. They were the survivors, the hardest of the hard, whittled down from a mighty host of 100,000 that had marched from Germany with the fervent goal of retaking Jerusalem from the great Saladin. The Third Crusade was Christendom's grand response to catastrophe, and while the famous kings, Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, sailed the sea, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, called Barbarossa for his fiery red beard, chose the land route. It was a decision born of an emperor's confidence in his own logistical might, a confidence that was now being tested to the point of destruction. Their journey through the territories of their supposed allies, the Byzantines, had been a masterclass in betrayal. Promised supplies never arrived, guides led them into ambushes, but that was mere prelude. The true nightmare began when they entered the domains of Sultan Kilij Arslan II, the lion sword of the Seljuk Turks. Kilij Arslan was a master of a new, terrifying form of warfare. He understood that to defeat a Crusader army, one did not need to meet its steel wall of knights head-on. One only needed to let the land and the elements do the work. His Turkish cavalry archers were phantoms, swirling out of the dust clouds on their agile steppe ponies. They carried the composite bow, a weapon of terrifying power and range, capable of punching through chainmail at 200 yards. They would appear without warning, unleash a storm of arrows, a dark cloud that blotted out the sun, and then vanish back into the haze, leaving a trail of wounded men and dying horses. They were the masters of the Parthian shot, firing backwards at a full gallop, a tactic that felt both cowardly and inhuman to the heavily armored Germans. The chronicler Anspert, who marched with the army, wrote of the constant, knowing fear. The Turks hovered around us like vultures, and no man was safe, not for a moment. The air was filled with the cries of the thirsty and the dying. This was not war as the knights of Europe understood it. There were no glorious charges, no chivalrous challenges. This was death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, grinding attrition designed to break not just the body but the spirit. Wells were poisoned ahead of them. Crops and storehouses were put to the torch in a ruthless scorched earth policy. The Crusaders, marching in 90-degree heat in 60 pounds of steel, died not with swords in their hands, but from heat stroke, dysentery, and sheer dehydration. Their magnificent European destriers, the powerful war horses that were the engine of their shock tactics, collapsed by the hundreds, their great hearts giving out, turning the march into a corridor of equine corpses. After 1,000 miles of this hell, the Grand Army was a skeleton of its former self. The 100,000-strong host was now a collection of perhaps 15,000 hollow-eyed, emaciated, and desperate men. Their mail was rusted, their shields scarred, their faith tested to its absolute limit. And as they stumbled into the plains surrounding the city of Iconium, modern-day Konya, they saw the culmination of their suffering rise before them. Iconium was not just a city. It was the beating heart of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the symbolic center of Turkish power in Anatolia. Its defenses were a masterpiece of medieval military architecture. Triple-ringed walls that stood 30 feet high, studded with dozens of watchtowers, and manned by a fresh, confident garrison of 5,000 troops. Its granaries were overflowing, its arsenals stocked with weapons, and its reserves of the terrifying Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that burned even on water, made a direct assault seem suicidal. In living memory, those walls had never been breached. It was here that Kilij Arslan II decided to finish his masterpiece of annihilation. His main field army, a force of 40,000 warriors, a seemingly endless sea of mounted archers and heavy Gulam cavalry, closed in from the east, cutting off any hope of retreat. The Crusaders were perfectly, utterly trapped. To their backs lay the desert they had just crossed, a wasteland of their own graves. Before them stood the impregnable city, and on their flank the assembled might of the Seljuk Empire, fresh, supplied, and confident of victory. By every law of military science, it was the end. The math was simple, brutal, and inescapable. Inside the emperor's command tent on the evening of May 17th, the air was thick with despair and the smell of defeat. The map spread before them showed only catastrophe. His son, the young and fiery Duke Frederick of Swabia, his face smudged with dust and anger, argued for one last, glorious charge. "Let us die like knights, father, with our swords in our hands, not starving like dogs in this desert." Other generals, their spirits broken by the long march, begged the emperor to sue for terms, to negotiate a surrender that might at least save the lives of the few who remained. The Bishop of Wurzburg, his vestments stained from the trail, led the commanders in a somber prayer, begging for a divine miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. And in the center of it all sat Frederick Barbarossa. His famous red beard was now more white than red, a testament to his 68 years and 4 decades of relentless warfare. He had fought rebellious princes in Germany, defiant popes in Rome, and rival kings across Europe. He had survived battles, sieges, and political intrigues that would have broken lesser men. His face was a roadmap of scars and weathered lines, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes, held a calm, almost unnerving stillness. He listened to the arguments of despair and desperation, but he was not listening for a consensus. He was listening for the echo of a pattern he alone had discerned. While his commanders saw only Turkish strength, Barbarossa had seen Turkish psychology. He had spent the 3 weeks of the harrowing march not in despair, but in intense, analytical observation. He noted that the Turkish attacks, for all their ferocity and deadliness, were deeply predictable. They relied entirely on harassment, on exhaustion, on never presenting a fixed target. They were masters of the feint and the flight, but this very mastery had bred a profound and fatal arrogance. They had grown so accustomed to their enemy's inability to respond that they could no longer conceive of an enemy who could. They fought the same way their grandfathers had, believing no Western army could ever endure the Anatolian furnace long enough to muster a decisive counterblow. Their confidence, Barbarossa realized, had curdled into a hubris that could be exploited. He stood, the firelight glinting off his eyes, and the tent fell silent. The authority in his posture was absolute. "We will not retreat," he stated, his voice low and steady, cutting through the panic, "and we will not defend." He placed a calloused finger on the map right on the icon representing Iconium. "We will attack here and here." He then moved his finger to a point east of the city, where the Sultan's main army was encamped. Simultaneously, he revealed a plan of such breathtaking audacity that it seemed, at first, like the ravings of a man broken by the sun. He would split his already catastrophically outnumbered force in the face of a superior enemy, a move that defied every principle of warfare since Sun Tzu. It was an invitation to be annihilated in detail. But Barbarossa was not playing by the old rules. He was writing new ones based on a deep understanding of his opponent's mind. He would send his son, Frederick of Swabia, with a mere 3,000 men, a pitifully small force that included 700 of the remaining knights, on a direct, seemingly suicidal assault against the main gates of Iconium itself. The goal was not to take the city by storm, not initially. The goal was to provoke, to insult, to sting the pride of the garrison commander. Barbarossa was counting on Turkish arrogance. He was betting everything that the sight of this small, exhausted force would be too great a temptation for the garrison to ignore. They would see an easy victory, a chance for glory and plunder, and would sally out from behind their impregnable walls to destroy it, leaving their gates vulnerable in their overconfidence. Meanwhile, Barbarossa himself would take the main body of his army, some 7,000 men, and face the Sultan's 40,000. But he would not form a defensive square, the traditional response to being surrounded. Instead, he would deploy his men in a thin, spread-out line on a gentle slope, a formation that looked weak, disorganized, and desperate. He was making himself the bait. He would invite the full weight of the Turkish army to crash upon him. And hidden in the center of this seemingly vulnerable line, concealed by the infantry, he held his ultimate weapon, the instrument of his counterstroke. 500 knights of his personal imperial guard. These men were different. While the rest of the army had starved, Barbarossa had secretly hoarded fodder and supplies for them. Their horses were the last of the great destriers, still strong and powerful. Their armor had been meticulously maintained, their swords sharpened, their spirits guarded from the general despair. They were not just soldiers. They were a brotherhood of the finest warriors in Europe, men who had trained and fought together for years. And they were masters of a formation that was the most fearsome tactical innovation of the medieval age. The Eisenkale, the iron wedge. This was a human spearhead, a triangle of concentrated steel and flesh designed to focus the entire kinetic energy of a cavalry charge onto a single, devastating point, capable of punching through any line ever formed. The plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He was using the Turks' own greatest strength, their numerical superiority and their contempt for the Crusaders' condition, as the very weapon of their destruction. He was betting his life, and the fate of the entire crusade, that Kilij Arslan's arrogance would blind him to the trap until it was far too late. After the stunned silence in the tent was broken by a flurry of protests and prayers, Barbarossa did something that cemented the loyalty of his men forever. He left the command tent and walked among his soldiers. He moved slowly through the camps of starving infantrymen, past knights who were sharpening swords they believed they would use for the last time. His presence was a catalyst. He was not a distant, unapproachable monarch. He was a warrior king, his own armor as scarred and worn as theirs. He stopped, placed a hand on the shoulder of a young, fear-filled soldier, and looked out at the faces gathered around the dying fires. His voice, though tired, carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Tomorrow," he said, the words cutting through the night, "we remind them why their grandfathers feared the iron men of the West." The phrase spread through the camp like a jolt of lightning. The iron men of the West. It was more than just words, it was an identity, a legacy. They were no longer a starving, desperate mob. They were the heirs of Charles Martel, of Charlemagne, of the legions that had forged Europe. That night, the palpable despair began to harden, transforming in the crucible of their leaders' resolve into a grim, terrifying, and determined calm. They would follow the Redbeard into the mouth of hell itself. Dawn on May 18th, 1190, broke over an Anatolian plain tense with the promise of slaughter. The air was still and cold, holding its breath. As the first rays of sun painted the high walls of Iconium in hues of orange and gold, two Crusader columns marched out from their camp, their paths diverging in the pale, unforgiving light. The smaller force, led by the young Duke Frederick of Swabia, moved with a purpose that belied its size. 3,000 men, with 700 knights at their core, advanced directly toward the towering gates of the Seljuk capital. They made no attempt to conceal their movements. They wanted to be seen. Their banners, tattered and stained from the long march, flew high, a deliberate act of defiance. From the ramparts, the Turkish garrison watched, first in confusion, then in mounting derision. To them, it was the ultimate act of Frankish foolishness, a final, suicidal gesture of a broken army. The sheer, overwhelming pride that Barbarossa had counted on now took hold of the garrison commander. Why should they cower behind their legendary walls when a swift, glorious charge could ride down these exhausted infidels and secure an easy victory? The main Turkish army was engaging the Crusader host. This was a chance for the garrison to claim its share of glory. With a great, grinding roar, the massive, iron-reinforced gates of Iconium, which had not been breached in living memory, began to swing open. From within, a flood of Turkish cavalry erupted. 2,000 strong, their silks and banners a brilliant, swirling tapestry of color, their lances tipped and ready, their war cries echoing across the plain. They expected to scatter a demoralized rabble, to harvest easy plunder and heads. They were met not with fear, but with a wall of disciplined, vengeful steel. The young Duke Frederick had learned his lessons well from his father. He did not allow his knights to charge headlong into the chaos. Instead, his infantry instantly snapped into formation, locking their shields into a testudo and presenting a bristling hedgehog of spears. From behind this wall, the crossbowmen, the few who had survived the march, stepped forward. Their weapons, slow to load but terrifying in their power, cranked and released. The thick, armor-piercing bolts cut through the bright silks and light mail of the Turkish horsemen with a sickening finality. The initial, confident charge shattered against this unexpected, disciplined resistance. The battle at the gates devolved into a brutal, close-quarter melee, a chaotic symphony of shrieking horses, screaming men, and the terrible, visceral crunch of steel on bone. Swords rose and fell. Maces, designed to crush armor, swung in bloody arcs. It was a fight of inches, of desperation and grit. And in the heat of this confusion, the unthinkable happened. The great gates of Iconium, swung open for what was supposed to be a triumphant sally, had been left unsecured in the Turkish commander's overconfidence. A handful of Crusader sergeants, men of low birth but iron will, saw their chance. With a desperate roar, they fought their way toward the entrance, ignoring the arrows and spears that sought to stop them. They reached the massive wooden doors and threw their bodies into the gap, preventing the panicked Turks inside from heaving them shut. It became a brutal tug-of-war over a sliver of space, a threshold between salvation and doom. More and more of Frederick's men, seeing the opportunity, poured into the breach, their desperation fueling a berserk strength. The fighting spilled from the threshold into the narrow streets of the city itself. Iconium, the impregnable, the heart of Seljuk power, was being violated. The sounds of combat now mingled with the screams of terrified civilians and the crackle of spreading fires. The Lion Sword's capital was bleeding. 2 miles away, the main event began to unfold on the stage Barbarossa had so carefully chosen. The emperor had arrayed his 7,000 men on a gentle, sloping rise. To the Seljuk scouts watching from a distance, it was a pitiful, heartening sight. The Crusader line was thin, spread out, and seemingly disorganized. Shields drooped, men stood as if in a daze. It was the perfect image of an army on the verge of collapse, exactly the image Barbarossa wanted to project. Sultan Kilij Arslan II, observing from a commanding hilltop, took the bait with the relish of a predator moving in for the kill. He gave the order and the very air seemed to tear itself apart. The deep, throbbing beat of Turkish war drums filled the plain, a sound that vibrated in the chests of the waiting Crusaders. Then, the sky itself began to darken. 10,000 Turkish horsemen swept forward in a vast, flawless crescent, a movement perfected over generations on the steppes of Central Asia. Their cry, Allahu Akbar, was a unified roar of faith and certainty. And then they let loose their first volley. The arrows fell like winter hail, a chronicler would later write, so thick and relentless that the sun was blotted out and day was turned into a grim twilight. But the Crusader line did not break. It did not even waver. At Barbarossa's calm, prearranged command, every man raised his shield. They moved not as individuals, but as a single organism, interlocking their shields in the practiced, overlapping pattern of the Roman testudo, a technique preserved and passed down through the ages. The storm of arrows rattled against this artificial shell, a deafening, continuous drumbeat of certain death being denied. A few men fell, a lucky shot finding a gap in the armor or a vulnerable spot, but the gaps were instantly filled. They were absorbing the storm, biding their time. Then they began to give ground. Slowly, deliberately, they stepped backwards up the slight slope, making a grand performance of their weakness. They feigned disorder, they allowed small parts of the line to appear to buckle. The Turks, smelling blood and sensing the imminent collapse, pressed their advantage. They fired volley after volley, but at this closer range, their arrows simply rattled harmlessly off the advanced plate and chainmail of the knights. They drew their sabers and pressed closer, their formations compressing as they swarmed toward what they believed was a beaten enemy. The Sultan, watching this from his hill, saw his victory unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. His enemy was bending, breaking, moments from snapping. He committed his reserves. He sent in his heavy Gulam cavalry, his own elite armored horsemen, the counterparts to the European knights, to deliver the final crushing blow. The entire Seljuk army now surged forward, a tidal wave of men and horses, all converging on the seemingly vulnerable Crusader center. In their eagerness for the kill, they sacrificed their greatest asset, their mobility. They became a dense, packed mass of flesh and steel, funneled into the killing ground Barbarossa had selected. It was at this precise moment of peak Turkish confidence, when victory seemed mere seconds away, that a messenger, his horse lathered in sweat and its eyes wide with panic, galloped up to the Sultan's position. He threw himself from the saddle, his words tumbling out in a gasping rush. "Iconium!" he screamed, pointing a trembling hand toward the city. "The Franks are inside the city, the gates are lost, they are in the streets." Kilij Arslan II froze. The triumph on his face melted into a mask of stunned disbelief, then dawning horror. He was caught. He was caught perfectly in Barbarossa's trap. To save his capital, his treasury, his very family, he would have to disengage his entire army immediately. But to disengage now, with his forces so deeply committed and pressed so close to the enemy, would be to turn his back on a wounded lion. It would invite a massacre from which his army would never recover. He was trapped between two catastrophes. He made a fatal, split-second calculation, a gamble born of the same arrogance Barbarossa had predicted. He believed he could crush Barbarossa's main force in a matter of minutes, then wheel about and save the city. He screamed at his commanders, "Press the attack! Now, finish them!" He had taken the bait completely. The trap was about to spring. High on his warhorse, in the center of his seemingly beleaguered line, Frederick Barbarossa watched the Turkish army bunch together, their momentum stalling as they compressed into a single, target-rich mass. He saw the moment their fluid cavalry tactics dissolved into a static, crowded scrum. A faint, grim smile might have touched his lips, invisible beneath his great helm. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting those of his trumpeter, a man who had been at his side for 20 years. He did not shout. He did not need to. A single, almost imperceptible nod was all it took. The sound that split the air then was not a human cry, but a single, clear, piercing, and deliberate note from a Crusader trumpet. It cut through the cacophony of battle like a blade. It was the signal. What happened next was a piece of theatrical military genius. The center of the Crusader line, which had held so firm against the onslaught, suddenly and smoothly parted. It was not a break. It was a curtain being drawn aside. The infantry shields swung open like a gate, revealing what had been hidden behind them. And from within, his secret weapon, his coup de grace, emerged into the harsh Anatolian light. 500 knights of the Imperial Guard. They were not the skeletal, half-dead figures the Turks expected. They were fresh, their armor polished to a dull gleam, their great warhorses, the last of the mighty destriers, pawing the ground with impatient power, their breath snorting plumes of vapor in the dusty air. They moved with a chilling, silent discipline. Without a shouted order, they formed up, not into a line, but into a shape that struck dread into the hearts of all who understood its meaning. The Eisenkale, the iron wedge. At the tip of this human spearhead was the giant form of a man like Count Berthold of Nuremberg, or Marquard of Neuburg. His lance, a giant steel needle, aimed at the heart of the Seljuk host. The knights behind him fanned out in precise, disciplined rows, each subsequent line adding its weight and power to the formation. In unison, 500 lances lowered, the steel points creating a terrifying, bristling wall of imminent death. It was a formation of pure, concentrated physics, designed to focus the entire kinetic energy of a charging horse and armored man into a single, unstoppable point, capable of punching a hole through a mountain. Barbarossa himself rode to the front of the wedge. He drew his longsword, the blade catching the midday sun and flashing a signal of cold fire. He pointed it, not at the individual soldiers, but at the very center of the densely packed Seljuk host, right at the spot where the Sultan's green banner flew. It began not as a mad gallop, but as a deliberate, earth-trembling trot. The sound was a low, rhythmic drumming that built with every passing second. The trot became a canter, the canter became a full, earth-shattering gallop. 1,000 iron-shod hooves hammered the Anatolian plain into a cloud of dust. It was the sound of rolling thunder, a man-made earthquake. The knights, their visors down, became faceless, anonymous demons of steel. The wind roared in their ears, a deafening hymn to violence. They uttered no wild, chaotic war cries. The only sound was the deafening, rhythmic, terrifying, and unified thunder of their approach, a sound more frightening than any human scream. The Turkish army, moments before so confident and aggressive, stared in paralyzed horror. The sight that met them was their worst nightmare realized. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, flank to flank. There was no room to maneuver. No room to wheel their nimble horses and use their bows. They were a dense, static mass, facing a wall of steel and horseflesh moving at nearly 30 miles per hour. The fear was instantaneous and contagious. The cry of Allahu Akbar died in their throats, replaced by a rising tide of panic. A young German knight, whose later letters home provide a chilling first-hand account, described the moment of impact. "I saw the fear in their eyes just before we hit. It was a look of pure animal terror. They knew. My world then became a storm of splintering lances, screaming horses, and the terrible wet crunch of metal breaking bone. I swung my sword until my arm grew heavy, and when I could see clearly again, I was surrounded not by enemies but by ruins. The iron wedge hit the Seljuk center with the force of a divine hammer. The effect was not of a battle, but of a demolition. The front ranks of Turkish cavalry were simply obliterated. Lances shattered on impact, sending deadly wooden shrapnel in all directions. Horses and men were bowled over, trampled into the dust by the relentless momentum of the destriers behind them. The wedge did not slow. It did not stop. It plowed through the Turkish army as if it were a field of ripe wheat, leaving a corridor of carnage in its wake. It was a physical and psychological shock from which the Seljuk force could not recover. The cry went up from 1,000 Turkish throats, a wail of utter despair. Allah has abandoned us. The invincible army of Kilij Arslan II, the masters of Anatolia for a century, shattered. The orderly attack became a disorganized retreat, which became a blind, panicked rout. The Sultan's green banner, the proud symbol of his power and the rallying point for his troops, wavered, tilted, and then fell, disappearing into the churning, bloody mud of the battlefield. Seeing the decisive breakthrough, the entire Crusader line surged forward with a roar that seemed to shake the very heavens. GOTT will it. The infantry, the spearmen and swordsmen who had endured weeks of torment, humiliation, and starvation, now fell upon the fleeing Turks with a vengeful, pent-up fury that was terrible to behold. Barbarossa had given the order, no quarter, no prisoners. This was not a chivalric tournament, it was a lesson in total war and extermination. The field ran red with blood. The dust turned to a thick crimson mud. The slaughter was methodical, relentless, and absolute. The catastrophe for the Turks now reached its horrifying climax. As the shattered remnants of the Sultan's field army fled in disarray towards the only sanctuary they knew, the walls of Iconium, they ran headlong into Duke Frederick's forces, who were now pouring out of the city's eastern gate, having secured the main streets and squares. The fleeing Turks were trapped in a perfect, nightmarish pincer. Barbarossa's pursuing force, a tide of vengeful steel, drove them directly onto the waiting spears and swords of Frederick's victorious, battle-hardened men. It was a slaughter of biblical proportions, a killing box from which there was no escape. The fighting ceased to be a battle and became a grim, mechanical process of butchery. The Crusaders, their own suffering fresh in their minds, showed no mercy. By the end of the day, the plains outside Iconium were a grotesque, sprawling carpet of the dead and dying. The scale of the loss was staggering. Conservative estimates, based on later historical analysis, placed Turkish casualties at a minimum of 10,000. Some contemporary chroniclers, perhaps exaggerating but capturing the sheer shock of the event, claimed it was 5 times that number, suggesting a figure as high as 40,000 or even 50,000 Seljuk dead. Against this, Crusader losses were miraculously light, perhaps only a few hundred men. The disparity was a testament to the perfect execution of a perfect plan. Inside the conquered city, the sack was under. On the morning of May 19th, the Sultan's own brother, who had been besieged in the city's citadel, emerged under a flag of truce to surrender. The terms he offered were total and reflected the scale of the disaster. 100,000 gold pieces, 500 high-ranking noble hostages, full provisions for the Crusaders, march, and expert guides to lead them safely to the Syrian border and the Holy Land. Barbarossa, his strategic objective utterly achieved, accepted. He had accomplished the impossible. He had broken the power of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, secured the land route to Jerusalem for the first time in a century, and avenged the torment of the long march. But history, in its cruel irony, often snatches its greatest triumphs away at the moment of their consummation. The story of Frederick Barbarossa does not end on the blood-soaked field of Iconium, but in the cold, swift waters of a river in distant Armenia. Just 3 weeks after his greatest victory, on June 10, 1190, the 68-year-old emperor was leading his reinvigorated army towards its destiny in the Holy Land. While crossing the Salif River, now the Gurksu River, the unthinkable happened. The great Frederick Barbarossa, a man who had survived 1,000 battles and the machinations of a dozen kingdoms, drowned. The accounts vary. His horse may have slipped on the slick river stones. He may have suffered a heart attack from the icy water. The immense weight of his armor may have simply pulled him under. The cause matters less than the consequence. The man was gone. His death was a catastrophe far greater than any military defeat. The heart and soul of the German Crusade was extinguished. The army, bereft of the legendary leader who had forged them into an instrument of victory, simply disintegrated. Their spirit broken by this final, cruel twist of fate, many knights and soldiers turned back for home. Others succumbed to disease and desertion. A ghost of the great host, a pale shadow of the force that had triumphed at Iconium, eventually straggled into Acre to join the other crusading armies, but the driving force, the strategic mind that could have changed everything, was gone. The Battle of Iconium stands today as one of the most brilliant, tactically perfect victories in the entire history of medieval warfare. It is a timeless masterclass in the art of command. The use of an enemy's strength against them, the supreme importance of psychology, the devastating potential of disciplined shock combat, and the value of audacious, unpredictable leadership. It was Frederick Barbarossa's masterpiece, the crowning military achievement of a long and glorious career. But it also stands as one of history's most poignant and haunting what-ifs. What if that old lion, with his veteran army now hardened in the fire of Anatolia and flush with the confidence and wealth of Iconium, had reached the Holy Land? What if his strategic genius, his iron will, and his battle-hardened legions had joined with the martial ferocity of Richard the Lionheart? Could their combined pressure have been enough to dislodge Saladin from Jerusalem itself? The question is unanswerable, a path in history that was forever closed by the waters of the Salif River. The thunder of the Iron Men at Iconium was their last, glorious roar, a magnificent echo of what might have been, fading slowly but inexorably into the silent dust of time. This story, lost between the pages of history, reveals a truth we must not forget: that the course of our world is often changed not by vast, impersonal forces, but by the courage, cunning, and will of individuals in their finest hours. The fate of empires can turn on a single decision, a moment of insight, or the unwavering resolve of one man standing against the tide. But this is just the beginning. The history of the Crusades is a vast, intricate tapestry woven with countless other epic tales of betrayal, faith, sacrifice, and battlefield brilliance that have shaped the world we live in today. The struggle for the Holy Land is a foundational drama of our civilization, and to understand our present, we must understand these seismic events of the past. Don't let the story end here. The journey is just beginning. Become an explorer of the past. We bring these incredible stories to life every week. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the heart of history. We are your gateway to the past. Join the community of the curious. What chapter of history do you want us to uncover next? Do you want to witness the brutal siege of Acre, a 2-year nightmare of starvation, disease, and combat where the fates of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin first truly collided? Or should we decode the Battle of Arsuf, where Richard's disciplined hammer-and-anvil tactics met and shattered the mobile warfare of the East in a display of incredible military control? The choice is yours. Tell us in the comments below. Own your knowledge, dive deeper than the video.